Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well, and it's time for another edition of the YUNOREVIEW, where I go over a series of records I didn't get a chance to review full-length style over the past month, talk about them in a series of mini reviews, a gauntlet of mini reviews. You know what it is at this point, I hope. And yeah, that's it. Let's get into it. Ba-bam! Here we have the new Death Cab for Cutie album, not their worst record, certainly better than their last one. In an odd way, it kind of reminded me of one of my favorite Ben Gibbard-related projects, Postal Service, in that the music sounded very sanitary, very pristine, kind of futuristic, though the smart lyrics and passion, heartbreak, and super catchy songs were nowhere to be found. Yeah, it's pretty underwhelming and somewhat lifeless, though, again, I do appreciate what they were shooting for, I guess. Unfortunately, I think you can kind of put Alice in Chains up on the board with this one, with many of the other 90s bands who have continued to drop music into this decade, who have really kind of given into a lot of the cheap modern rock studio trickery that makes a lot of recordings in the genre these days sound incredibly lifeless, gutless, and really lacking all of the raw excitement that made Alice in Chains interesting in the first place. Yeah, this was pretty generic. The guitar tones were bland. The production just really kind of sucked anything cool that could have come out of this record out of the room. So there we go. One of dancehall and reggae's boldest and most memorable voices is back with a new album. It is a pretty versatile record with a lot of solid features, some tight and catchy production. I do think his voice sounds as original and as one-of-a-kind as ever, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword with SASCO, because while his voice does really stand out, as it is incredibly deep and raspy, has a ton of passion and personality, there are a limited amount of contexts in which I think his voice can be done justice. And when he does try to stretch beyond his comfort zone on this record, some of the results do come out kind of awkward. But if you do want to hear a mix of modern reggae and dancehall with a one-of-a-kind voice, give this thing a shot. Look, I know I liked a few tracks from this album in my weekly track roundups. I was looking forward to it. I was hoping it would be better than their last, but unfortunately I just don't really see this album as an improvement for the Lemon Twigs. This thing sounds like if the Rolling Stones were trying to make a really bad school musical. The performances are really awkward and amateurish, and obviously there's an element of intent to that, but it doesn't really make them any easier to swallow. The drama and the singing throughout the record is really theatrical and campy, but in maybe the corniest way possible. And I'm not really enjoying a lot of the deep cuts on this thing either. It just feels like kind of a mess. Justin Vernon and Aaron Dessner team up once again as the Big Red Machine for a full-length album. It's sometimes folky, sometimes electronic, sometimes experimental, sometimes straightforward, sometimes underwhelming, sometimes exciting. It's really all over the place. I mean, it's not a very consistent album. I wouldn't give this thing a shot unless you really wanted to hear Aaron and Justin take a series of artistic shots in the dark for one track after another. Some of the songs come out really good, some others not so much, but at least they're trying to forge some new ground or do something a little different. It's just kind of like a weirdo sketchbook from two artists that hold quite a bit of weight in the indie scene. It's okay. We have another album here from Dreamville's own boss, a J. Cole disciple, and I roughly feel the same way about this record as I did his last album. I mean, his flows are pretty laid back, very melodic, very smooth. The instrumentals don't really hit all that hard either. They're pretty, they're soulful, but they're very mild and light on the ears. His sound is mature, it's likable, it seems like he's putting some kind of passion and thought into his lyrics, but the end result is really just bland. His lyrics don't hit me all that hard. His performances just kind of fall into the background. It's just very middle of the road. The man clearly has a solid baseline of talent, but for the most part, it just feels like he's making chill out and vibe music like everybody else, but he's trying not to be as ignorant as possible. So if you want to hear an album that's more of a thinking man's vibe, then I guess I'll give this a shot. There was a time when Pig Destroyer was one of the most terrifying and vicious bands in grind. And now they just sound as chunky and overly heavy and as meat-headed as just like a generic metalcore band, which is basically how a lot of these songs play. You know, there are some spots where it's just super sped up, super fast. You have some blast beats, you know, some grindcore bits, actual grindcore. But a lot of the time it just feels like, again, really meaty metalcore riffs throughout. The vocals even take kind of a metalcore tone a lot of the time. It just feels like Pig Destroyer going metalcore. And with some really bland, uninteresting results. You know, it's listenable. It's hard-hitting, I guess, but it certainly doesn't stand out. Not in 2018's musical landscape. Overall, this thing is a pretty likable art rock record. Anna has some super solid vocals and some very despondent atmospheres, maybe her most eerie and gothic album so far. But some of the songwriting is kind of bland. The lyrics occasionally leave a little to be desired, but there are some solid songs on here. You know, there are some pretty theatrical vocals, though I do sometimes think she's going a little over the top with it to the point where it does get slightly obnoxious. But, you know, I think there are more great things about this record than there are bad things. You know, so if art rock and very dramatic front women are your thing, very strong singer-songwriters with a powerful and womanly tone to their voice, then give this thing a shot. The new Wild Nothing is okay. I guess the singing and the songwriting is a bit bolder than it was on the last album. Certainly not as washed out on this record over here, but for the most part, the aesthetics and the melodies on this record just feel completely indebted to just jangle pop and synth pop and new wave of the 1980s and early 90s, to the point where it's incredibly distracting and it's hard to see this album as just not living in the shadow of that era and feeling like a watered down take on it, because I don't feel like Tatum's approach to the whole sound on this thing is all that refreshing. Whereas you could argue on his previous efforts, there was a very modern and dreamy, contemporary yet trendy take on those sounds that he was delivering, and pretty well. Now that just doesn't really seem to be as much the case, and it's just okay. It's so sad and yet so bland and so cleanly produced. Like, I guess I just don't see the appeal of music that's trying to be this intimate and moody, and yet it sounds so idyllic to the point where it doesn't really feel like anything's wrong. It sounds like it's trying to communicate genuine feelings of heartbreak, and yet the vocals are so boring and lifeless. Meanwhile, the production is so pillowy and in such soft focus. I feel like I'm just being subjected to a bad afternoon soap opera. Outside of the more stripped back and piano-driven moments on this thing, I just didn't really feel for this record and the songs on it at all. Yeah, just not for me, I guess. Next, the new Scars on Broadway. Some of the hardcore System of a Down fans have been asking me what I think about this, and I'm sort of unhappy. You know, I wish we could get another goddamn System of a Down album, but instead we are being subjected to tracks that just sound like demos at this point. You know, it's not even that Surge isn't involved with this, but it just sounds like rough recorded System of a Down tracks that would later be built up into something else. And that's so disappointing. The Winnipeg Noise Rockers and Sludge Metalers Ken Mode are back with a new full-length LP, 35 minutes long, pretty tight, straight into the point, not as post-hardcore heavy, and punk intensive as their last full-length album. I feel like they're going back to the blistering, faster, heavier sounds of their material prior to that, which I thought was okay, but for the most part flew by at such a speed where very little of it actually landed and left an impression on me. And despite how aggressive this album is, I'm feeling roughly the same way about this new album over here. It is very hard-hitting, it is very in your face, but I feel like very little of it actually leaves an impression on me, as it just feels like a flurry. And that's not to say that it's just really about the speed and the pace at which everything moves. I mean, I don't really think a lot of the riff writing is all that either. I don't really get whipped up in a lot of the grooves of the album, and I don't know, a lot of what's presented here doesn't really feel all that different from what the band has done in the past. Maybe a shade or two less extreme, which I think works against this record, honestly. I mean, look, if you're huge into noise rock or you're huge into sludge metal, give it a shot, because there are a lot of good things going for it. Seems like there are a lot of people enjoying this record, but I don't know, I don't think it's one of the band's best. Been getting a lot of requests for this new Choker album. Unfortunately, I'm not really all that into it, though I do hear some of the great things in this record that a lot of you guys are. I like the fact that it's experimental. There's a lot of cool sound play on the album too. On the production end of things, it's very, very creative and kind of cutting edge. But when it comes to vocals and songwriting and just musical style, I feel like Choker has a lot to do to sort of evolve past this overt Frank Ocean influence, to the point where if you told me some of these tracks were like Frank Ocean demos, I maybe might believe you or something. So I feel like Choker has a lot of good things going on, a lot of potential, but it cannot just be slightly more experimental Frank Ocean worship. It can't. Next, Uniform. I was kind of looking forward to this LP because the teaser track sounded super extreme, and certainly the sound of this album is that. It is so blisteringly loud that I was afraid my speakers were breaking or busting as I was listening to it, because it is that ugly coming out of really anything that I listen to it on. Like, it is ear-searingly loud. However, I feel like compositionally and vocally, there's not a whole lot to what the band are doing. It just kind of sounds like generic, aggressive, hardcore-ish punk music, but produced in such a way where it is just eardrum destruction for one track after another. I appreciate the extremity with which the band has approached the whole sound front of this album with, but as far as like the riffs and the vocals and the songwriting, there's not a whole lot I want to return to. Though again, I am impressed at how destructive the sound of this album is. Yeah, this new Paul McCartney album's a little bit of a mess. I mean, there's some decent piano rock on here and power pop occasionally, some ballads that are okay, but it's really inconsistent, and the song "Fuh You" might be the worst song of the year. It may just be. I mean, there's some spots on this album when it does sound like, wow, Paul really still has it. You know, he's still kind of got it. But "Fuh You" is like the awful song to end all awful songs. It's like he's trying his best to sound like a terrible millennial songwriter. God, is it terrible. One of the most brutal progressive rock bands in Zool outfits are back with a full-length LP. It's been a while since I've heard a new album from these guys. And they sound really tightly composed. They sound like they're playing their goddamn hearts out. But I have not been able to get past the production on this LP. I feel like the drums are mixed in such a wonky fashion. The vocals and the horns are so high to the point where it feels like the zany vocal harmonies and which, if you're familiar with Zool music, you will know exactly what I'm talking about, are just like right up in my ear, whereas I just wish they were a bit lower and mixed in more of a group, so you're kind of hearing like a separate chorus. It just feels like the instrumentation isn't all that balanced. And I mean, if you're familiar with KOENJI's music at all, you really want to hear the drums in a crisp and a bright and an upfront fashion, because Yoshida Tetsuya is an amazing drummer. I love his work on previous records from the band, on many Ruins albums too. Maybe I'm just being a bit finicky here and a little too overly judgmental on the sound of the album, because it's not like I dislike the compositions on the record. It's not like I dislike what I can make out of some of the playing on this thing, but it just seems like there's not a whole lot of balance between what's going on with the bass, the percussion, and the treble on here. The keyboards just seem very, very digital, and that kind of distracts me a bit too. Yeah, there's not a lot of balance, I guess, in the mix on this thing, and it's a bit obnoxious. And for me personally, it's unfortunate, because it did kind of ruin my enjoyment. Though for a lot of fans, I guess it's not a big deal, because I've been seeing some people say some really great things about this album. And this is most likely one of the few albums in this style you're going to hear this year, if this is in fact your kind of thing. So, I don't know, I guess give it a shot if you're a huge prog guy. And that is it for this edition of YUNOREVIEW. Everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully you guys didn't hate my takes on some of these albums too much. What did you think about all of them? Did you love them? Did you hate them? Why? What do you think I should review next? Over here next to my head is another YUNOREVIEW video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, YUNOREVIEW forever.